think, act, and prosper. You are now tuned into the Money Level Show.
So the Fed seems like they're under a lot of pressure. I've been seeing Jerome Powell. I think recently he talked about the national debt going to be an issue sometime in the future. And you know, sometimes it's like we don't know if they're just playing a little game with us, or you know, if they're like, you know, being passive about a lot of stuff, and then you know, gonna implement certain policies and stuff in kind of like a nonchalant way or whatnot. So what's your take on the Fed right now? I mean, you know, it's obviously their policies are gonna impact, you know, everybody, especially if they're financing, you know, the fiscal policies. And you know, then we got Biden coming back with another $4 trillion plan, or however much that is. And you know, one thing that I've been communicating to my audience is like, all this money isn't free, you know, and at some point, you know, it has to be paid for. And so what's kind of your take on the Fed right now, fiscal policy, and just what do you expect going forward? You know, inflation, deflation, things like that. What's kind of your thoughts?
My base case is some degree of inflation for a period of time. And so, you know, we are getting some inflationary effects right now. I mean, if anyone looks at the price of lumber, for example, you know, it's pretty much skyrocketed. And if you look at a broader set of goods, I mean, we've had, you know, even the official CPI, which has some limitations in being, you know, accurate for inflation, but even using that metric, I mean, we're up 2.6% from a year ago in terms of inflation. And the Fed's policy right now is that they're purposely, you know, keeping rates at zero and, you know, creating new base money to buy treasuries and mortgage-backed securities until inflation runs over 2% for a sustained period of time, the way they measure it. And so they use core PCE to measure inflation, which is, you know, it excludes food and energy. And so if those go up, then core inflation is lower than, you know, total inflation. And so, you know, basically until inflation is from the way they measure it pretty hot for a long period of time, they plan to keep that you know, those rates low. And so that has a couple implications. One is if you're holding money in a bank, right? So you made, like, you know, roughly 0% last year holding money in a bank, while inflation averaged, you know, according to official measures, 2.6%. And depending on your own basket of goods, like your own expenses, your personal inflation rate could be a lot higher than that, while your money is just not earning anything and therefore gradually, you know, melting like an ice cube. And so if you look back in history, there are periods of time where you have, you know, what's called financial repression, which is essentially purposely holding interest rates below the inflation rate for a long period of time in order to inflate part of the debt away. And so if you look back in the 1940s, for example, the United States fought World War II, and we built up a lot of debt from that, huge deficits. And, you know, in order to keep financing costs low, the Federal Reserve came in and artificially suppressed the yields. And the reason they had to keep, you know, interest rates low is if you have a country with 100% debt to GDP, for example, and if you're paying 5% or 10% interest rates on that, you're going to go bankrupt. You're going to spiral, and you're going to keep increasing the money supply, and it's going to balloon out of proportion exponentially. So what they do is they push down the interest rates, so that helps kind of, you know, keep the debt from spiraling too much, but it can be very inflationary. And so GDP can grow faster than the debt at that point. And so if you look back in the 1940s, you had an average inflation rate of something like 6%, and it included spikes up to as high as 20% during very brief periods of time. And yet the Federal Reserve held the 10-year Treasury at 2.5% for the entire decade. Just kind of held it there by using their balance sheet and being willing to buy treasuries if they went over that yield. And so if you were holding cash in a bank, if you were holding treasuries, you lost purchasing power over the course of that decade, even though you made more dollars in the nominal sense, right? So you're still making 2.5% a year, but you were losing like 6% a year in purchasing power. And so I think the 2020s are probably going to look something like that. Maybe not as extreme. In fact, I hope not as extreme, but I do think we're likely in a period where money in the bank or treasuries, whatever yield they have is probably going to be lower than the inflation rate. and that the Fed's going to be pretty much doing that on purpose for as long as they can. And so that that kind of informs us about what other assets we might want to own. We might want to own things that have some degree of scarcity to them, whether it's precious metals, whether it's digital assets, whether it's commodity producers, whether it's high quality equities, whether it's your own property that your real estate that you own, and of course it's very challenging because that sort of policy can boost those asset prices a lot, and so we get these rolling bubbles, right? So we have one set of months you might have NFTs go through the roof in terms of price. Other periods of time you might have tech stocks having a blow off top, getting super expensive. Another time you might have copper and lumber going up really high in price. And so it's still important to navigate and not kind of buy when things are just going vertically up and kind of get too euphoric. But I do think it's important generally to be in assets that have some degree of scarcity, rather than heavily invested in assets that can be printed and that are yielding below the inflation rate.